Alrighty. The syndicates of the backstreets are a bunch of quote-unquote criminal organizations that rule over the lower class of the city. Unfortunately for quite a lot of fellows, crime is quite legal here, forcing the city to more or less function on private police outside of the taboos of the head. These syndicates form up either as petty gangs, more organized gatherings, or even subsidiaries of the most powerful, known as the Fingers. Unfortunately, our case today is one feather turned syndicate, without such an association with any of the Fingers. Rather, they're a tad unfortunate in their current disposition in the city. Welcome to the stage, the Blade Lineage. On the surface, these are a bunch of cutthroats coming out of District 19 of S-Corp, Sao Pipio Agro Industries, the company that more or less controls a vast majority of food production within the city, with a predominantly anachronistic Joseon-era style culture. Such culture extends to the Blade lineage, and their plight is inevitably intertwined throughout the course of Project Moon's stories, at least from the main core of fellows we follow from them. After all, for a feather-turned syndicates, their structure is quite loose. Not the level of loose that makes up the Pinky's star members, but more the feeling of barely being a proper organization. They're a ball of contradictions in their creed as well. Let me outline that real quick here. According to the pages from Ruiner's general receptions, the Blade lineage isn't known for coordination. It's little more than a cohort of people who have nowhere else to go, or those who carry the intent to murder someone. It goes on to speak on the commonality of wanting people dead and otherwise knowing their place in the food chain as closer to the bottom. As for Kim's page, it feels like they have the edgiest edgelord leading them by reading his. I don't think I can do it any justice by paraphrasing this one, so We value the arts of violence more than anything here. Those with an unscathed body are not permitted to join us. A swordsman who does not have a single blade scar on his skin is doubtlessly too careful when he wields his weapon, and his inane hesitation will be an obstacle. Too irresolute to endure the wounds his own blade would leave, let alone the assault of others. A body free of scars is proof of cowardice. Alas, it would be wise not to expose your wounds outside of those on your face. I don't know how we got from band of murderous misfits to fuck around and find out, murderous swordsmen and women, but here we are, I suppose. And this is without the cunt distorting first. I suppose it may come down to Kim being the nobler representation of them as feathers, whereas the cutthroat page levies their on-the-run status instead. Regardless, the creed can be summed up as, if you got nowhere else to go, and if your life's already given you a beating, come join the Blade lineage and become a slayer. Apologies if I'm not being the most charitable with them. These fellas have been the source of quite a few headaches in the past, and an endless supply of Aura Monster memes for years. I can firmly place them as one of my least favorite organizations at this point, mostly because they're a bunch of Joseon ruffians who are once more than that. The downfall of the Blade lineage is quite simple to outline. Once they were among the more prevalent feathers in the Joseon-era style backstreets of S-Corp, sheltering the weak who are willing to become strong, protection fees, elimination of opposition, everything your typical mob is of like to do in a poor or low economics era. But then the higher-ups of S-Corp let the Kurokumo in, thus leading to a pretty nasty fight between the two. Blade lineage members and Kurokumo members were at massive odds with one another, with the Blade lineage ultimately losing out with the murder of their benefactor. The leader of the group then took a vengeance, but an incomplete one, functionally branding them as traitors to the corporation. Now fallen from feather to syndicates, they go on the run, traveling off to T-Corp. Unfortunately, they run into the Kurokumo again, barking a proper strife. With losses mounting and outs fading as a last-ditch effort, their leader at the time took a wild gamble on the library, where they'd ultimately get booked. When the events of Ruiner's finale play out though, they of course get sent back into the city, but scattered into the back streets of T-Corp once again, where the bus crew runs into them and aids them for a time. Their fates from there are rather dismal, but we'll cover that with Kim and Aeng-du later on. All that to say, the Blade lineage may as well not exist anymore, not in any real form. They may as well be Pinky aspirants or the Pinky at home, for lack of a better way of placing things. Now, ranks in the Blade lineage seem to be as wishy-washy as their bloody organization's creed. There's just two that we realistically know about. Talsu and Mentor. Zalsu simply translates to murderer or assassin, the cutthroats of the Blade Lineage. Functionally, they're all-rounders. While the name implies that they're supposed to be murderers and assassins, they kinda just do everything in the organization. Scouting and reconnaissance, send a Zalsu. Fighting a strife, send the Zalsus. Extorting farmers or other backstreet residents, a Zalsu will do the job. At the very least, within the rank, there seems to be a meritocratic respect between one another, though that really isn't anything unique within the city. Most high-ranking individuals, at least so far as syndicates and fixer officers that we run into, have the power to back their ranks, despite grades supposedly being not the best measure of power. Regardless, being meritocratic isn't something special here, making the Blade Lineage just very run-of-the-mill as far as matters go. Beyond there is Mentor. We're privy to just the one, that being Bamboo-Hatted Kim, but functionally the guy acts as their leader and director. He mobilizes them, handles the deals with the politicians, and even brings them to the library in the end. There isn't much left for him to command at this point though, what with the vast majority of his organization torn to shreds, himself on more than a few shit lists, etc. But I digress. The organization feels to be small enough that he may indeed be the only mentor left, with all the Zalsus and cutthroats aspiring to his level of skill. Regardless though, what kind of skills do they show off? Well, quite clearly they study the blade. I can't say I'm well versed in Korean martial arts, let alone what kind they're displaying here, but at least in terms of swords, those should be the Hwando and Jikdo for the most part. More traditional Korean swords. The premier fighting style of the Blade Lineage, revolving around taking hits to trade harder hits back, is very romanticized. That's not how you fight ideally. A bad trade is straight up a loss in a vast majority of real-life scenarios. Trading out a blow is a dramatic device, normally reserved for dramas, games, and the luxuriously rich that have armor to tank set a blow with impunity. Risking your combat capability to punish someone is one of the single dumbest things to do. Now before you get your pitchforks out and crucify me for calling their signature lame, we are in the city. The baseline is far more than just chumps with weapons. We've got augments and prosthetics too, so perhaps there's some justification for this specific method. That said, it's mostly just Kim himself that seems to abuse this level of reckless abandon, at least the in-taking hits part. We do see Aeng-du have a certain degree of disregard for her body in some sections, but nowhere near the degree of yielding one's flesh to claim their bones. Anyhow, historical gripes aside, let's talk on the notable members of this bloody organization. We've got only 2 characters this time, but 6 Sinner IDs this time around. There's inevitably one more next week, though I think that one will mostly speak on the more personal matters to Aeng-du and their integration into the LCD. Speaking of which, Aeng-du. She's a Zalsu that may as well be Kim's right hand. She's an insanely loyal member of the Blade Lineage and no slouch when it comes to her capabilities to boot, fighting tooth and nail when the bus team first runs into her even. That said, in past, before we run into her, she was part of Kim's group venturing into the library. They inevitably get booked and released. As the true ending of Ruiner specifies, they're scattered and misplaced. In this case, right back into the throes of the Kurokumo clan they had been strifing with. The strife in T-Corp territory inevitably reignites, and we save her from impending death. She's initially distraught by her taking in by the bus crew, but Yi-sung, also from S-Corp, manages to calm her down, and we bring her along through the course of the rest of the intervalo. Past there, we tackle the Kurokumo, she aggressively forges ahead, all to find her mentor. Upon learning of his fate, she can't bring herself to believe it, and almost immediately gets cut down for her beliefs, saved only by Sinclair. He solves the distortion, and then she begins to distort. Dante commands Muso to knock her out, and damn, we actually stopped the distortion from happening firsthand, huh? Beyond there, we run back into her during the Unsevering, Canto 9. She's joined up with the LCD, slapped together with the Distortion detective crew. As the group splits and moves on various objectives, her team is accosted by the middle nurse father and apprentice, causing a rather nasty fight to break out. In a last-ditch effort, she uses one hell of a sword to charge the man down, and ultimately loses both her arms. From there on, she's screwed out of combat for the time being, but as per the preview we've gotten a few days ago, well, she's gotten some prosthetics to go, I suppose. Though there's plenty of memes that her replacement arms were just Levantine grafted onto her. Then comes Bamboo-Hatted Kim himself. This one is a lot. Rather, he may as well be the entire organization, since with him out of the picture, the organization may as well not exist. That, and he's the face of it all. Without Kim, the Blade Lineage would not be anywhere near as popular as it currently is in the fanbase, and the rabbit aura farming would basically be non-existent. All that to say, the fault lies with Kim for almost everything this syndicate has to offer, and everything wrong with this bloody organization anyway. For the head of an organization of Salsu, cutthroats, and assassins, Kim is rather quite noble in his actions and intentions. He's a man of few words, but the ones he does make use of are rather verbose and purposeful. While his logic may as well be fuck around and find out, at the very least, he has a code he sticks by. That said, he works directly as a bodyguard for one of the counselors of S-Corp, the same such counselor trying to root out the corruption facing the wing. Functionally, this would place his syndicate in a more privateering kind of situation, in this case becoming something of a feather in a wing. Not the cleanest feather, nor the most stable, but compared to such an aggressive force sowing unrest like the Kurokumo, perhaps the Blade Lineage seems a bit more like saints in sheer comparison. That said, the organization still did its usual murder, extortion, etc., just under a more noble guise with Kim's leadership. Now, his book in Ruina is a mess, clearly remnants of an older time where the Blade Lineage may have played a more major role there, but instead here we are with this seemingly incomplete and edgy mess that is fully at odds with his Limbus counterpart. Anyhow, he failed in his duty. The counselor died, assassinated by his rivals. It is then implied that he went and took revenge upon the corrupt officials personally, either wiping out an awful amount of their forces and wounding them severely, or otherwise devastating their ranks. He leaves off with a warning instead of finishing the job personally. If he ever finds a force capable of rooting out the corruption, he will return to do so. He departs S-Corp with his fellows in tow, vowing to return one day to enact his plan. The Blade Lineage from here moves from district to district, being hunted down by the fixers of S-Corp, the so-called Chinokkun, the ones utilized by the royal courts, the same such being sent to extinguish the Blade Lineage, are known to be on the level of taboo hunters. Essentially, they're being picked off by some of the finest there is. Anyhow, they venture to T-Corp, get into further scuffles with the Kurokumo, and in a desperate attempt to escape, pack their things and ship themselves off to the library. As we know through Ruina, their presence there was supposed to be heavier, but instead we got them as a general reception. All that to then say, they got brutally booked. As the true ending plays out, they're scattered around T-Corp backstreets, where the strife reignites. Herein, Kim is returned to the Yongjin building, alongside a bunch of his compatriots. They fight a hard-fought battle with the Kurokumo, until only a handful of the Blade Lineage remains, his fellows falling like flies around him. He distorts. Man has fucking had it, and the corrupting influence of the monolith was not helping. He begins cutting down his allies. Rather, begins cutting down everything in the room indiscriminately. It's one hell of a mess by the time we get to him. Heck, the Kurokumo captain outside was guarding the room in order to wait on the support of the Thumb to handle the cunt. He was just that hard to take down and not worth the extra men to bully into submission. The boss team eventually tackles his fathoms and brings him back from the brink. The premier method for dealing with distortions works. Enter the fathoms, beat them up. That said, Aeng-du has had enough of his bullshit, taking him behind a sofa and gouging at his flesh. She wishes to end him for cutting down his allies, a bit ironic considering what she's about to do. He's stopped promptly by Muso as she too begins distorting. Beyond there, he is retrieved by the LCA and left recovering at the LC headquarters. While there's a moment of hype where people thought Kim was about to join the House of Spiders raid, this is mostly a misread on the lines. It does, however, clue us in that he has joined up with the LCD team. Last I ought to cover is his observation log. It's one that is lacking information and incomplete, but it is written out by Otis. He outlines the intensification of distortion as we enter his fathoms, alongside changes in physical appearance that we are privy to, black tendrils, the stronger blue glow from his eyes, and shite communication. Rather, she notes the last one to be kinda present originally. Anyhow, beyond there, she talks on resentment and strong grief being carried by him, those being channeled into wrath through the concept of Han. Said Han going beyond to increase his combat capabilities. She goes on to empathize with his plight to an extent, that burden of leadership. However, goes on to spite the fella for retaining such an emotional state. She finishes off by quoting, "It doesn't matter how famous he used to be, how powerful they said he used to be. We can more than easily handle such a weak-willed commander." Anyhow, now we are on the precipice of his reintroduction into the story. I know a lot of fellas are hyped for him, but I'll be frank, I'm really not. We'll get to that later though. We've got all these sinners to get through. To kick us off, we've got Yi Sung, a Salsu. Rather, everyone but Musou coming up is going to be a Salsu. The man is wistfully looking out the window while Otis chats him up. They seem to be on the run as they reminisce on their old titles and position within the Blade Lineage. It's a slightly uncharacteristic exchange, and the rare one between Otis and Yi Sung to boot. They speak on heading south from S-Corp, looking for new territory to extort, as well as figuring out how they should further go about things. They exchange some cryptic words, but otherwise it's a very, very short Uptie story as one of the first ones out there. As for anything else of note, he was a pre-order bonus. Man came with your account if you started within 30 days of the game's launch. Otis comes next. Following right after Yi Sung, her story is real short, essentially being an obsession with swordsmanship alongside the inevitable betrayal of her master. Essentially the very old approach to Sinner Uptie stories, just being bespoke organization, but Sinner flavored. In this case, the Blade Lineage, but Otis. She does at least embody the Ruiner version of the Cutthroats, killing to survive and whatnot. Don't waste your resources just to see this story, though if you did, you at least have a very set and forget support passive to make use of these days. As for the yellow twink Sinclair, his is somehow even shorter than the above two. The concept of Slayer is brought up here for a second time, the first being with Yi Sung's one. Seems to be some kinda bloodthirst or crazed state that the Blade Lineage members are supposed to go into. That or some kind of classification like an Asura, I suppose. Anyhow, Sinclair has an internal monologue about whether or not he was just some crazed killer, and whether or not he wishes to be one. That's about it really, nothing of heavy consequence. Musou is just Kim's mirror, pre-distortion. It follows the events of the man's life up to the vengeance taken. We get many background details on Kim through here, including his potential to attain the title Blade of Clouds, the best of the best within the nest. Instead, he turned down the privilege in order to serve under the second counselor here, out of which would see to the rooting out of S-Corp's rampant corruption. They reminisce for a while as they play back and forth at their game. There's discussion of S-Corp's corruption, the role they intend to play in stamping it all out, and their commitment to the cause. Unfortunately, they fail to protect the counselor, instead going on a rampant revenge plot. Without any evidence pointing to the corrupt parties, Musou's actions here seem very impulsive and take his entire organization down with him. We get plenty of crumbs here revolving around their pursuers, the Chinookun, that of which we will inevitably see as they don't let the borders between nests get in the way of their operations. You can find no deadlier and more tenacious pursuers, accordingly. Moving along, we've got Faust. Hers takes place right after Musou's actions earlier. He reminisces about flowers, art, and her blade work, but also the role that the Blade Lineage was supposed to play. He goes on about the mentor's actions and how they could have been his own personal sense of justice, a way to save S-Corp from its downfall. But alas, it is time to run. The Chinookun have already been dispatched. There's no other choice. It is implied that the organization had to scatter first before regrouping, losing many of their compatriots in the effort to do so. We get a quick summary of the events that follow, the migration to T-Corp, and the strife with the Kurokumo, but little else beyond there. Don is our last perspective for now. Being on the run with Otis, they're sampling some liquor. Don is chastised on decorum by Otis. Seeing as the Blade Lineage was once a feather, they probably shouldn't be so uncouth, right? At least so that upon return they can serve with the correct decorum befitting of their station. Anyhow, besides their back and forth on etiquettes, they are still on the lookout for the Kurokumo and any that would do harm to the Blade Lineage, Don having acted as some kind of scouts. There's one more mention of Slayers again, but that really wraps it up for now. So what are my final impressions on these guys? Well, I don't like them. They're a walking contradiction, at least so far as how the organization treats itself compared to the boss. The people within are tired, but the boss stayed too noble in dragging them through the mud. So thoroughly dragged through the mud they were that even his spirit was broken and he faced distortion. The Blade Lineage is thus something of a proud organization, ultimately a fragile one made with a weaker mindset that on the outset sounds smart and strong. Empty, beautiful words disguised to look tough. The fragility of the organization being held together by one individual who could barely control his own guys is potentially tragic, but never truly feels it, I suppose. It doesn't help that half the information we get is rather contradictory, mainly because the timing doesn't 100% line up perfectly, and it feels like Project Moon doesn't know what to do with these guys in the end. The version we got in Ruiner was already of two contradictory tales. A group that accepts everyone with murderous intent, but at the same time turns you away if you are without scars. Beyond there, we're then treated to them as as if they're a bunch of wandering Asura Blade psychos with the concept of slayers in their earlier iterations, only to then have the rug pulled out under us, saying they were a more noble feather, a bunch of bodyguards for a wing official. Moreover, the amount of loyalty and collectiveness they show in Limbus also contradicts that idea that they're barely held together as an organization, making this whole thing rather maddening. If this is some kind of psyop to disguise the Pinky's trainees, with all the inconsistencies, I'd bloody believe it at this point, especially with said Slayer term also conveniently coming up in some of the Pinky's titles and skills to boot. All in all, this is one of the most mishandled groups in Project Moon. Any amount of consistency seems thrown out the window with them due to uneven characterization and a definite shift in direction partway through their development. While we at least now have Aeng-du as a proper character now, Kim feels like he's about to be a complete and total wreck of a guy, especially seeing as we didn't get any semblance of on-screen time for his mental recovery. He's not quite a real character still, and well, we'll be seeing how they decide to paint an almost blank canvas over this time, whether or not they can reconcile all the impressions of the Blade Lineage in one. If they just use him to aura farm again, I will be very disappointed. There's a story there, but the threads are so badly severed that it's pretty rough to properly put together. We're gonna need a fair bit of magic to get things in proper order. Kim isn't a depthless aura farmer, but god is he far more shallow than people give him credit for. Regardless, thank you for using me as second monitor content. I know it's been a bit since I last uploaded something, but dead weeks kinda don't have much to talk about. I've been streaming LobCorp in the meantime and joining up with a few collaborations for APR this year. You can catch me hosting a few of those towards the end of the month. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and if you want to see more in the future, subscribe to the channel. For further support, consider joining up on the Patreon or otherwise donating to the Ko-Fi. You can be like Artie and Derp over there. Thank you too for your continued support. Next week is going to be a lot busier, seeing as we're getting an Intervalo and a few IDs, so be on the lookout for that when it comes around, I suppose. Once again, thanks for listening in. Appreciate it.